The occupiers are in a panic. Ukrainian forces are cutting off their logistics, Russians are worried about a Ukrainian offensive, and Z-bloggers are suggesting people start thinking about returning Ukraine to its 1991 borders. We'll also discuss Russia's tactics and the ongoing terror against Ukraine's civilian population. Friends, we'll be talking about how Crimea will return to Ukraine, including today on the show In the Crosshairs. My name's Alexander Prepodovny, and let's get started.
Ukrainian drones are actively destroying the occupiers' logistics. In Primazoric, Zaporizhia region, a drone destroyed a fuel truck that was headed to Crimea. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported strikes on targets in Crimea. These include a Panzer S-1 air defense system near Salavidne in the Krasnovodsk district and a vessel in the waters near the village of Mezhvodne in the Chornomorsk district. A fuel crisis in Crimea. Right now, getting fuel on the peninsula is like trying to find water in the desert. Local residents are searching for gas stations. However, as of June 2nd, you can only get fuel if you have a special voucher, according to the occupation governor Azvijayev. The day before, on June 1st, the daily supply ran out in just a few hours.
May 31st, 2026. Russia, Republic of Crimea, City of Sudak. The fuel situation, as you can see behind me. Come visit tourists in your own cars. We're happy to welcome you. But how you'll get back, we have no idea.
At the moment, there are serious restrictions on transporting hazardous materials across the Kerch Bridge, also known as the Crimean Bridge, which the occupiers imposed after several Ukrainian attacks on it. The depletion of military equipment and fuel reserves, caused by damage to or complete destruction of the railroad ferries, may still force the occupiers to use the Kerch Bridge, said Navy spokesperson Dmytro Platenchuk. By the way, the so-called R-280 Novorossiya highway, where the Ukrainian armed forces are now actively using medium-range drones, supplies not only the Crimean Peninsula, but also the Russian troop grouping on the southern front, in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. The Institute for the Study of War has also confirmed that Ukrainian medium-range strikes are disrupting Russian logistics from Luhansk all the way to Crimea. Even the Kremlin has admitted to problems with fuel supplies to Crimea. Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary for Russian dictator Putin, said that authorities at all levels are working to resolve the issue.
Joining us now is Vladislav Seleznev, military analyst and Ukrainian colonel. Hello, Vladislav. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Here's what I want to ask you. It was a terrible night. 6 people were killed. The Russians lost 73 missiles and 656 drones. Unfortunately, there were casualties both in Kyiv and in other regions. There are children among the dead, and the number of victims has been rising by the hour. Just while the segment was running, I saw again on Telegram channels how missiles are hitting residential neighborhoods in Kyiv directly. I want to ask you, is this tactic of intimidation and terror exactly what he meant? What Putin meant by a new stage of the war? Or is it something else?
Yeah, I believe that's exactly what it is. That's the main message from Vladimir Putin and his inner circle. Without any success on the battlefield, they're trying to create conditions for missile and drone terror in order to force Ukraine's top military and political leadership to accept the Kremlin's ultimatum. In fact, the Kremlin is demanding our capitulation. On the battlefield, things are going neither here nor there for them. 14 square kilometers in the month of May. That's the maximum they've managed to achieve. The Russian army was able to capture this at the cost of hundreds and hundreds of Russian soldiers' lives. Accordingly, this result definitely doesn't meet the hopes and expectations of the Kremlin elders. So, in order to somehow push Ukraine to comply with the Kremlin's ultimatum, that's what they're doing. That very same missile and drone terror. I live on the outskirts of Kyiv, and it just so happens that I have a panoramic view. From my place, I saw those very strikes hitting different districts of our capital. And I also saw the effective work of the Ukrainian air defense system. And honestly, I think we should give credit to Colonel Yuri Ikhnat, who articulated everything absolutely clearly. Both our capabilities and our miscalculations, as well as our shortcomings in repelling this massive missile and drone attack. Yes, there are no miracles. The enemy is using a huge number of ballistic missiles, and the only antidote to them are PAC-3 class missiles for air defense systems, Patriot missiles from American manufacturers. This is a very serious enemy, and we have rather limited resources to fight against them because aside from Pac 3, other missile systems and their corresponding missiles are not capable of acting as effectively or delivering the results we need. That's exactly why there have been dozens of strikes. That's why there's been massive destruction among medical and educational institutions in our capital, and that's why there are casualties. I think, for the sake of fairness and in memory of the residents of the Dnipropetrovsk region who died today during the Russian attack, we need to remember their victims as well, because at least 6 people in the Dnipropetrovsk region also lost their lives, and dozens more were injured. I think we really need to talk about Ukraine as a whole and not just single out the Kyiv region where we are operating. We're talking about this very missile and drone terror carried out by the Russian army. But the key point is the following. What we're seeing now is, in fact, an act of desperation by the Russian army because they have nothing else to offer for the soldiers and officers of the Russian army simply can't do anything else. Their successes on the battlefield are quite modest, and there are absolutely no prospects for the Russian army to improve the situation on the battlefield. None at all. This is despite the fact that right now, natural, geographic, and climate conditions are actually favorable for increased Russian activity. Because the greenery has returned to Ukrainian forest belts and woods, the ground has stabilized after the spring rains, and accordingly, the mud season is over. So, in principle, the enemy could operate on a large scale and quite effectively, but it's just not working out. Why? I think there are at least 3 factors behind this. The first and main factor is the resilience of Ukrainian soldiers carrying out their missions on the battlefield. The next factor is, thank you, the effectiveness of those very engineering and technical structures and fortifications which serve to slow down and even completely stop the advance of the Russian army. And the third factor is the drone component. No matter how much we continue to praise the truly remarkable and positive achievements of these Ukrainian drone operators, I honestly believe that it is still simply not enough to capture their full impact. Because creating a kill zone up to 30 kilometers deep is, without a doubt, a very, very significant achievement. Creating a situation where Russian logistics are literally burning up at depths of 80, 100, 150, even 200 kilometers is also an incredible achievement by Ukrainian drone operators who, by hollowing out Russian logistics in this way, rid the aggressor of any illusions that they can accomplish anything with their weapons. On the battlefield,
Vladislav, here's what I want to ask you. You mentioned logistics, and that's our next topic. Essentially, the so-called Novorossiya highway is now under the fire control of the armed forces of Ukraine. And here I'm reading a statement from Gherkin, a war criminal, who says that Ukraine could actually launch a counteroffensive in the southern directions because right now the occupying forces are left without supplies. I want to ask, does Ukraine even need to carry out any counteroffensive actions right now? Or is this remote destruction of the enemy's capabilities actually the real success and the final goal at this stage? What do you think about this?
well, Strokovich, yes, I pay very close attention to him because even though he is an enemy, he's a smart and competent opponent. So some of his ideas definitely deserve to be followed. They should be studied in detail. Yes, absolutely. For quite a long time now, he has been saying that Ukraine is about to launch a large-scale counteroffensive with the goal of blocking the Crimean Peninsula and clearing it of enemy presence. But let's look objectively at what's happening in the south. Ukraine does not have the technical resources to carry out a large-scale amphibious landing operation. The only large landing ship, the Konstantin Olshansky, has been held captive since the events of 2014 in Crimea and Sevastopol. The medium landing ship Konstantin Olshansky sustained critical damage, and it's unlikely that it will ever, or at least in the medium term, be restored and returned to the ranks of the national naval forces. Carrying out a landing operation with high-speed boats is not feasible. This is definitely not about a large-scale operation, and it's definitely not about the possibility of landing on the coast of Bryuni and Patori or Sevastopol. This is our armored vehicles, and any operation to land in Moscow. Anton, but in fact, that's the reason for the failure. Therefore, despite the fact that the enemy is taking massive actions, trying to mine the coastal areas it controls in the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea, it's unlikely that we should expect such actions from the Ukrainian army. I believe it's unlikely that Russia will face a ground operation aimed at deoccupying Crimea or gain combat experience in the near future. For 23 years, in the area of the settlement of Kremki, which is on the left bank or left shore of the Dnipro, we have gradually developed an understanding that without stable logistics between the right and left banks of the Dnipro, we probably shouldn't count on the success of our actions on the left bank of the Kherson region. But nevertheless, the enemy, for example, is making a tremendous amount of effort, as much effort as possible. And the grouping operating in the territory of Crimea? Well, the concerns of the military opponent, Gherkin, are in fact driven by the very same worries that actually exist among the top military and political leadership of the Russian Federation. And basically, I think for us, this situation should be viewed as a factor in the gradual depletion of Russian military capabilities, because the enemy is using its resources irrationally, and it certainly isn't bringing them any closer to that moment of total superiority and positioning themselves in Crimea as the main military force. Well, it's clear that the Ukrainian army is acting so rationally and so effectively that the enemy often finds itself in a situation like, what is the Russian Federation doing in Crimea? It's like a suitcase without a handle. It's hard to carry, but you don't want to just leave it behind either. That's why I believe that the current actions of the Ukrainian army aimed at destroying the enemy's military and economic and logistical potential are absolutely logical. Just a few examples. There have been numerous reports of Ukrainian drones and missiles striking elements of the Russian army's air defense in Crimea. Data. Strikes on bases, arsenals, depots, on air force towns, and on aviation infrastructure. That's also a fact, as well as the destruction of transport, rail, and road logistics. These days, the official channels of the Russian gliders in Crimea are saying that they are forced, to some extent, to adjust the movement of railway convoys and other units of the Russian Federation on the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea. Why? Because Ukrainian drones, when they reach the area, including railway stations, can destroy enemy military convoys and damage infrastructure. That very key element of railway communication in Crimea. It is certainly no secret that the Russians are actively envisioning a massive missile and drone attack on the infrastructure of the Kerch Bridge, which is well known to everyone. In other words, the enemy is genuinely nervous. Their anxiety is caused by the fact that the Ukrainian army is now systematically and methodically destroying enemy military, economic, and logistical targets.
Across all of Crimea and Sevastopol. Imagine, I want to ask you now, who is this? If it was a vision, if it was Luke Tiabinikov, who was even suggesting the idea of returning to Crimea? The situation as of 1991 shows that if Russian society doesn't accept this now, then a series of successful Ukrainian strikes, including, so to speak, the restriction of fuel capabilities, yes, when both Muscovites and people from other regions could find themselves in a similar collapse. Because honestly, in the European part of Russia, I think oil refineries just don't feel at home at all. And he says that at some point, society might demand an end to the war at any cost. Do you believe in such an outcome? Or is this just, I don't know, an attempt by a Z-blogger to get creative?
Let me tell you a personal story. Just a few days ago, some residents of Crimea, among them good acquaintances of mine, and under circumstances I also experience, as a way to get information, up-to-date information about the situation in Crimea, they personally asked me to reach out to the top military leadership of Ukraine and ask them not to attack a certain piece of infrastructure, the Kerch Bridge, because soon it's the tourist resort season coming up. Traffic. Along the Novorossiya highway, which runs through the northern part of the Sea of Azov, traffic has become seriously difficult due to active attacks by Ukrainian drones and missiles. So they said, Vlad, talk to them, ask them not to attack the Kerch Bridge so we can do our jobs properly. The tourist season in 1926. I don't have the authority to give orders to, say, General Sursky, but the situation is quite motivating. The residents of Crimea understand perfectly well that their fate critically depends on the actions of the Ukrainian army. As for our actions, in my opinion, they're absolutely clear. We need to rid Russians of the illusion that they've come to Crimea forever. To do this, we need to destroy their military potential as well as their economic potential. And the strikes on infrastructure and the oil refining industry in Crimea are a vivid confirmation of this. And of course, the strikes on infrastructure. They happen with enviable regularity because even now, Russian ferries and rail connections through the Kerch Strait are already not working, and there are no options for restoring them, at least until September. Not at all. The Russian Kerch Bridge is constantly at risk because at certain intervals, it gets shut down for vehicle traffic due to missile or drone attacks, transporting equipment and supplies. Using military transport aviation is a very costly and not very promising option. Using the northern routes, like the Taganrog-Jankoy Highway, is also extremely difficult. Using military ships to increase cargo capacity in the waters of the Black Sea Eagles, that won't be possible either, so the Russians are on the verge of collapse. I'm confident that the Ukrainian army will continue to do everything necessary to rid the enemy of any illusions that somehow, in some way, they can stabilize the situation in the near future.
Vladislav, before we wrap up, I want to go back to Crimea for a bit. So there were specific targets that were destroyed. We're talking about the Panzer S-1 air defense system in the area of Krasnogvardetsky district, as well as other air defense systems. I understand this also applies to troop rotations. We can also launch strikes against Russian positions whenever we can determine exactly where they are and basically effectively diminish their capabilities in this regard, shift their strength, so to speak, and rotate forces on the ground. What do you think about this? How much of a sore spot could Crimea become for the Russian group right now? And could this affect the outcome of future special operations in the South?
Just a few days ago, I had the opportunity to speak live with Colonel Vladislav Voloshin, the spokesperson for the Defense Forces of Southern Ukraine. I've had a long history of communication with him back in the day. He was my deputy when I served in the General Staff. I asked Vlad directly what prospects the occupiers have in the south of our country. He literally answered me, the prospects are quite grim because there's more to come. Our gaining control over Russian military logistics shatters the enemy's illusion that they can use this logistics to supply their assault troops with all the necessary resources. That's exactly why the enemy's plans for a large-scale advance in the south of the Zaporizhia region are falling apart. That's why the enemy has no illusions left, except for trying to hold on to their lines and positions on the left bank of the Zaporizhia region. That's why in Crimea, the situation's getting out of control. Historically, that's how it happened. At one time, I started my service here as a cadet. Then, as an officer, I served in this military town in various positions. We're talking about the village of Perevalme. Right now, one of the mechanized brigades of the Russian occupation army is stationed there. And not long ago, that brigade's location was hit. At least 2 missiles and at least 2 attack drones struck. As a result, about 15 were killed and 20 wounded. In the Russian military quarters, the infrastructure of the military compound was destroyed, including the barracks and housing facilities, the headquarters, and some of the auxiliary buildings and equipment were partially damaged. So what we're saying is that one of the key military bases of the Russian occupiers in Crimea, which is quite heavily defended, was hit. Tactical level air defense systems, such as the Panzer S or missile complexes like Buk or Osa, are simply not capable of effectively defending against incoming strikes from Ukrainian drones and missiles. Why is this happening? because previously, and over a fairly long period of time, the Ukrainian army systematically and mechanically destroyed those very elements of the enemy's air defense system, creating those very windows or opportunities so that they could then systematically and methodically destroy the military potential of the Russian army stationed in Crimea and Sevastopol. I'm confident that what happened this time is just one of many episodes that will continue to happen again and again in the future, because the enemy absolutely must understand that they are on foreign land, and that land will burn beneath the feet of Russian soldiers along with their bodies, right up until the moment the last Russian occupier leaves. From this land of Ukrainian Crimea and Sevastopol, right now the Ukrainian army is taking all necessary steps.
As your colleagues joke, the problem with the Russian soldier's foot must be fixed. Thanks. Vladislav Seleznev, military expert and colonel of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, joined us live. Friends, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We're preparing new streams and live broadcasts for you. Our team is working tirelessly all day long. See you soon. Bye for now.